Hello, people. Welcome to the community of the Growth Mindset podcast. Guys, if you are a first time listener, don't forget to subscribe on whichever platform you're listening from so that you don't miss on more interesting episodes coming up in following weeks. And for our daily listeners, here we are again with a new episode where we will interview another interesting personality from a unique industry and understand how they were able to accomplish this great level of success. Remember, this is a podcast where we learn easy, practical methods and tips that we can implement in our daily lives from the very best and the most successful people known today. Because as we all know, success leaves clues. And we, the people having the growth mindset, will use these clues to create a better, more fulfilling, and a successful life. So, let the growth begin. Guys, today we have a very special and a very unique guest. His name is Rupert Sheldrake. Now guys, Rupert Sheldrake is a scientist, a TEDx speaker, and the author of multiple best-selling books. Now, one of the most unique work of Rupert is the idea of morphic resonance, which says all the plants and species have a collective memory from all previous things of their kind. We discuss on this podcast episode what is consciousness, what is spirituality, different worldviews and how they came into existence, be it atheism, materialistic ideas, and where does religion fit in? Is religion the thing of the past? Listen to the episode to find out and challenge everything around you. This episode will give you the opportunity to understand the world around you and give you a whole new, fresh perspective towards life. So, without further ado, let's get to the episode. But thank you so much for taking your time out and joining us on the Growth Mindset podcast. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Good to be with you.
Awesome. So, Rupert, you are a well-accomplished scientist and your theories are just mind-boggling. I've read a few of your books, like the first book that I've started reading is The Science and Spiritual Practices, which is amazing. Now, would you like to tell, a quick background about yourself? Like, how did you become a scientist and how did you reach where you are today?
Okay. I started off with a great interest in plants and animals as a child, and my father was a herbalist, a microscopist, and a pharmacist, and was very interested in science. So a lot of it is influenced from my father, who was a wonderful father and who helped me become really seriously interested in being a biologist. So I studied biology at school and at university. I was at Cambridge. But I became increasingly disenchanted with the kind of biology we were taught because it's mechanistic and materialist. And I noticed the first thing we did with any organism we were studying was to kill it and then cut it up. So I was interested in understanding the nature of life, and I came to the conclusion we were just studying the machinery of dead animals. So I began to look for a wider approach to biology, and I was lucky to get an award at Harvard, where I became a Frank Knox Fellow, and I studied philosophy and history of science to get a bigger picture. Then I went back to Cambridge, did a PhD in plant development, became a Fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, so I taught at Cambridge University. I was doing research on how plants develop. And that research led me to the idea that there is more to inheritance than just DNA and genes and epigenetic modifications of genes. And I came up with a radical idea, at least in the context of Western science, the idea of morphic resonance, a memory in nature. Each species has a kind of collective memory. But I found that didn't go over too well with my colleagues at Cambridge, and I realized to publish such a heretical idea, I'd have to think about it a lot more. And at that stage, I wanted a more holistic view. A parallel track of my development had been, being raised as a conventional Christian, going through a scientific education where my science teachers persuaded me that, science equals atheism. Religion is a thing of the past, science is the thing of the future, I wanted to be part of the vanguard of the movement of the future and stuff. So I was converted to a kind of materialistic, atheistic scientism. But I began to doubt that, partly through, as I said, my doubts about science itself. Then around 1970, I was introduced to, the first big step in opening me up was traveling through India in 1968. I came to India. I was meant to be stopping for 2 or 3 days on my way to Malaysia, where I was working on rainforest plants at the University of Malaya. But India proved so intriguing that my visit extended to about 3 months. I was rather late arriving in Malaysia. And I had a wonderful journey through India, and that gave me a completely new perspective. I later explored consciousness firstly through LSD around 1970, which shocked me out of my materialist worldview by direct experience. Then I wanted to explore consciousness without drugs, so I took up transcendental meditation around 1971. That was very fashionable at the time in the West. And I was doing yoga. And so I was very drawn to Indian philosophy. And when the chance of a job came up in India, I was very, very pleased to take it. There was a new International Agricultural Institute starting at the time, ICRISAT, in Hyderabad.
Okay.
And I was one of the first scientists to join the international staff of ICRISAT as the principal plant physiologist. So I moved to Hyderabad. I resigned my fellowship at Cambridge and moved to Hyderabad, which I absolutely loved. And I really enjoyed the work I did in the field, practical work. I went on thinking about morphic resonance. And at the same time, I was going to ashrams on pilgrimage to temples and so on. And then I had a Sufi teacher as well in Hyderabad. So I was sort of exploring Indian potentialities. But to my surprise, I found myself drawn back to a Christian path. And I was confirmed in the Church of South India when I was about 36. And I then discovered a wonderful teacher, Father Bede Griffiths, an English Benedictine monk who lived as a sannyasin in an ashram in Tamil Nadu. This was the perfect blend for me of East and West. And so I lived 2 years in his ashram altogether. And I wrote my first book, A New Science of Life, about morphic resonance in Father Bede's ashram. And the book indeed is dedicated to Father Bede. So since then, my book came out in 1981, so it was a long time ago. Since then, I've been doing research on morphic resonance. I've been exploring unexplored realms of science. I've had the advantage of being privately funded, so by a series of individual funders and one foundation that have enabled me to work independently, which is very unusual in science today.
Yeah.
And also continue my exploration of the interrelations of science and spirituality, which are both very much part of my life. I'm a practicing scientist. I've spent most of my life doing research. I still do. I'm doing more than I have done for years at the moment, because the lockdown has provided a perfect opportunity to really get on with it. And my 2 most recent books, Science and Spiritual Practices and Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, are about scientifically investigated spiritual practices. These practices have measurable effects. And the main research shows that spiritual practices make people happier, healthier, and live longer than those who don't have them. So in these books, each book, I discuss 7 different spiritual practices, which anyone can take up, whatever their religious background. And so they can be done by people who are spiritual but not religious. And there are a lot of people in Britain and America who call themselves spiritual but not religious, or people who are religious and spiritual. And I would say that probably many religious people also have spiritual practices. And
So
I think it's important to combine them, but there are a lot of people who'd rather just do the spiritual practices without a religious framework. So that's absolutely possible too.
yeah,
I mean, your insight and the kind of work you've done so far is amazing, and the kind of areas you've touched in your life are just marvelous. For example, the first thing that really blew my mind was morphic resonance, the idea of that. So, would you like to shed some more light on what morphic resonance is all about, and how does it work, so that people have more better understanding of this?
Yes, morphic resonance is the idea that there's a kind of memory in nature, that similar things influence subsequent similar things. So, for example, every young giraffe, as it grows as an embryo in its mother's womb, is similar to previous giraffe embryos. And it resonates with all previous giraffe embryos because it's similar to them in its DNA, its proteins, and so on. And so it draws on a collective memory of giraffe form. And then when it's born, on a collective memory of giraffe instincts. So these are like inherited habits of the species. So what I'm saying is that in animals and plants, genes only account for a small part of inheritance. They account for the inheritance of the structure of proteins. We know what they do. They're all about protein sequence, or control of other genes, which are about protein sequences, or RNA sequences. But they're not about the instincts of a giraffe to eat leaves on trees by stretching up to them, or about the shape of your face or mine, or the shape of the flower of a lily. They enable us to make the right proteins. All organisms can make the right proteins. But I think morphic resonance underlies the inheritance of form and instinct. Now, it's called morphic resonance because everything in nature is vibratory: atoms, electrons, light, everything in nature. And we ourselves have many different rhythms: biochemical rhythms, heartbeat, breathing rate, brain waves, sleeping cycles.
Yes.
Every organism is a composite of many different kinds of rhythm, and the resonance is between these rhythmic patterns of organization. And what I'm suggesting is that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits. In Western science, as a hangover from the philosophy of Plato and Pythagoras in ancient Greece, there's the idea that all the laws of nature are completely fixed from the beginning, that they never change. So in the context of the Big Bang theory, the assumption is that all the laws of nature suddenly appeared at the moment of the Big Bang, like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code. Whereas I'm suggesting that the so-called laws of nature are really habits, and that they evolve along with nature. There's a kind of memory in all nature, even in crystals and atoms. And this is a testable theory. It means if you train rats to learn a new trick in Delhi, for example, then rats in London and New York and Melbourne, Australia, should learn the same trick quicker just because the rats have learned it in Delhi. And there's already evidence that this rather surprising prediction actually happens. I have to say that when I was living in India, although in England, when I proposed this idea, I met with blank incomprehension or open hostility, when I talked to it to my Hindu friends in India, I got the exact opposite reaction. Instead of saying, "Wow, this is an amazing new idea," they usually said, "Oh, there is nothing new in this idea. Ancient rishis have said this thousands of years ago." But then when I tried to persuade them that it would be good to take it seriously and try and test it scientifically, then my Hindu scientific colleagues were less keen because they didn't want to do anything unconventional. They didn't want to lose their jobs, and they wanted to please their professors and that sort of thing. So no one actually was prepared to do anything about it. But sitting back in their chairs, in a discussion, and they were very happy to say, "Yes, of course, this is a well-known idea." Anyway, my point is to turn it into a scientific hypothesis and test it scientifically. And it's already had quite a number of tests, so far so good. But it's still wildly radical in the context of conventional science, and therefore highly controversial, difficult to get funding, and people are put off doing research on it because they're afraid that they'll lose their jobs or damage their careers or their reputations. Not unreasonably, because I myself have been attacked furiously by angry defenders of materialism And so I can understand why people are afraid. But sooner or later, I think that this idea will be properly tested. And I think it almost has to be true. I just can't believe that the laws of nature suddenly arbitrarily appeared at the moment of the Big Bang. And in the multiverse theory, each multiverse would have to have its own laws of nature. So even if people think laws of nature are endowed, each universe is endowed with the laws at the beginning and they're all fixed, they've still got to explain how they're remembered in that particular universe. There's a huge area of debate and discussion here, which is still going on.
Interesting. Now, I do know that this idea is pretty controversial when it comes to scientists. They don't want to accept this fact. But why are scientists in the first place opposing this instead of being open to at least evaluate this idea?
Well, the main part is fear. Most scientists are frightened. There's too many PhDs produced. There's a huge, intense competition for jobs and tenure and grants. And most scientists don't want to do anything that's unconventional that would spoil their chances. So they want to play safe. And they know this is a controversial theory, and they know that there are some people who are vehemently opposed to it. Now, the people who are most opposed to it, I didn't encounter any vehement opposition when I was living in India. I mean, I was able to discuss these ideas extremely freely with friends of all religious persuasions, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Parsi, Jain, and Christian. I had India was incredibly free intellectually for me. I mean, one reason I wanted to write my book in India is because I felt completely free when I was in India. But here, the scientific world in Europe has a tremendous baggage, historical baggage, which comes from the history of conflicts between science and the church in the 17th century, and then in the 19th century, many European governments, in the 18th century, the French government, in the 19th century, the Russian government, for example, were very reactionary. They claimed that they were ruling in the name of God. The kings or the emperor were supported by the church. And so people, particularly communists who wanted to overthrow the old order, thought that the best way of overthrowing it was to undermine the authority of these monarchs, who were supported, they claimed, by God and by the church, by arguing that God didn't exist. And so atheism became highly political as part of a left-wing agenda to get rid of traditional power structures in Europe. So a lot of the French Revolution attempted to abolish religion and abolish Catholicism in France. And they turned the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris into a temple of reason. Priests and monks were guillotined, monasteries were closed. And they proclaimed that the official religion of France was the cult of reason. Well, that was in 1793. And this had an enormous impact through the 19th century. Marx was a great Marxist. He was a great atheist. And a lot of the socialist and Marxist movements were militantly atheist. So among intellectuals in late 19th century Europe, it became very fashionable to become materialists and atheists, and science appeared to support the materialist atheist worldview. So the people who have attacked me, and there have been quite a few of them, every single one of them, I would say, is a militant atheist, and their agenda for attacking me is to defend materialism, which is an atheist philosophy of nature, which supports their worldview. And they're afraid that if materialism is questioned in science, then people start saying, well, consciousness may be more than the brain, maybe psychic abilities exist, perhaps there are real altered states of consciousness that link us with other forms of consciousness in the universe. All of this would undermine their materialist worldview. So they see me as a terrible enemy to be counteracted at every possible opportunity. But that's only a minority, even within Western science. I mean, the number of militant atheists is relatively small, and some of them are very well known, like Richard Dawkins. But the majority of scientists here in Britain, as I know from personal experience, are not militant atheists. Some are non-religious and agnostic. Recent surveys show about 45% of scientists, doctors and engineers are atheist, agnostic or non-religious. But about 45% here in Britain are spiritual but not religious, spiritual, religious. So the numbers of non-religious and religious scientists, or spiritual and religious scientists, is about the same. And in other countries, the proportion, I'm sure in India, the proportion of scientists who have religious beliefs would be much, much higher. I mean, when I was working in India, admittedly it's a long time ago, but there were practically no militant atheists among my acquaintances. The only one I knew had studied in Cambridge and had come back filled with, he'd been converted to atheistic materialism and was a kind of evangelical atheist, but that was just one out of all the people I met in years in India.
Correct. We have a similar study done, here in India as well. So there was a recent study, I believe there was a study done by Times of India in 2001, wherein they said there were around 7 lakh non-religious people. But after 10 years, when they did a study again in 2011, that number rose to 15 lakhs, right? Which was like a 15% increase in people who said that they're non-religious now, right? So the number is growing. That's why I wanted to touch base with you and understand as to these are some of the things that are happening in the world. And exactly as you pointed out, science is supporting the idea of materialistic views, wherein they want to support that, because if they don't, then they come into another problem of consciousness, right? Which may come that it is outside the brain, right? And not just within the brain. So talking about that on a conscious level and materialistic ideas, what are materialists in the first place for people who might not know or hearing in India for the first time? What are these materialistic views?
Well, materialism is the doctrine that matter is the only reality. And by matter, they include physical fields, of course, so matter and energy, the contents of physics. It's in its modern version sometimes called physicalism. And what that says is that matter is the only reality. The universe is made of matter. Matter is unconscious, and matter is purposeless. Matter just works automatically, mechanistically, like billiard balls colliding with another, pushing the others off in different directions. It's a mechanical system. Like a machine doesn't need consciousness to operate. It works through mechanical parts that are coordinated mechanically or programmed by a computer. So what it's saying is the universe has no purpose, no direction, there's no God, no gods, no consciousness out there. Everything in the universe has just evolved with no purpose. Evolution is just a matter of chance and natural selection. And consciousness, human consciousness ought not to exist, because if everything's unconscious, how come we're conscious? Now, this is the biggest problem for materialists.
True.
It's called the hard problem. We ought not to be conscious, and yet we are. So some materialist philosophers argue that we're not really conscious at all, that it doesn't, or if we are, it's just like a shadow of the activity of the brain, it doesn't do anything. No such thing as free will. And others argue that consciousness is nothing but an illusion produced by the brain. But as critics of that view have pointed out, illusion is itself a mode of consciousness. So saying that it's an illusion doesn't dissolve the problem of consciousness. Yes. It presupposes it. So, and that's why it's called the hard problem, because every time a materialist tries to explain away consciousness, they run up into a problem, and yet consciousness just won't go away, despite the attempt of so-called eliminative materialists to pretend it doesn't exist. Then, of course, it raises another problem for the materialists, because they say that everything you say and do is because you're a kind of zombie with a genetically programmed computer brain. Everything you say and do, you do because your brain makes you do it. But then what about their own belief in materialism? That's just something their brain makes them say. So why should we take it seriously? And why should they try and persuade you or me to be materialists, claiming philosophical arguments or even scientific evidence if we ourselves are nothing but genetically programmed computers. So it's not really consistent, and I think it's self-refuting. Nevertheless, this is the predominant worldview among intellectuals in Europe, and it underlies the entire scientific endeavor and, by extension, the medical and engineering fields. And it underlies our educational system and the academic system and government and industry. That's the commonly accepted secular philosophy. And religion, at least in Europe, has been privatized. It's okay as long as you don't talk about it in public or don't let it influence your life too much and just behave like a normal secular person. It's a bit like a kind of private hobby. And so that's the world that I live in. And in the church attendance in England is now about 5% of the population on a regular basis. And in a survey last year, the majority of the population described themselves as having no religion. So this is a very secular, godless society. And materialism is the dominant ethos, and most educated people feel that they have to pretend to be materialists even if they're not, because otherwise they'd get attacked. I compare it to communism in the Soviet Union under Brezhnev, where everyone pretended to be a communist, because if you wanted to get on in the world and get a better job, you belonged to the party and toe the party line. There were a few dissidents, but they were mainly locked up in psychiatric institutions on the grounds they must be mad if they didn't believe in communism. But when the Soviet Empire collapsed, how many real, true believing communists were there? I mean, there were certainly some, but they were a minority, and certainly not most people who pretended to go along with it. I mean, gave up pretending. And I think when the next paradigm shift occurs in science towards a more holistic worldview, a lot of people who at present have pretended to believe in materialism will just stop pretending. Even most scientists I know who in public pretend to be materialists, in the evening in a private conversation, I usually have completely different views and start telling about their own psychic experiences or near-death experience, or the fact they practice meditation, or they've been to a holistic healer or something like that.
Interesting. This is very interesting, right? Like people or scientists who do not believe in the idea of materialistic, like who do not even believe that religions exist or religions exist, spiritual practices are at the same time today, when they're alone at home, they are practicing things, which is a part of religion, right? Because they were the first one who develop these ideas of spiritual activities. So what role do you see, do you actually see religion and science coming together?
Well, yes. In the history of Indian thought, there's never been a sharp conflict between the realms of empirical inquiry and religion and science. I mean, you could say that yoga is a kind of science. It's very practical science of health, well-being, breathing, exercises, bodily postures, internal cleansing. These things are not mere sort of airy-fairy beliefs. These are practices that can be scientifically studied, and some have been scientifically studied, and they obviously have great benefits. And now, one of India's most successful exports, meditation, is now practiced all over the world. When I was a child growing up in England, I'd never heard of meditation, or at least I thought it meant thinking about things. But the kind of practice of meditation, there's now 18 million people in America who meditate. Here in Britain, large numbers of even atheists and materialists meditate. This is enormously successful, this spread of this, and this can be investigated scientifically. There have been many studies of meditation showing its effects on blood pressure, lowering blood pressure, well-being. People who meditate are less depressed, sleep better, have better levels of life satisfaction. Brain waves, changes in brain activity, even long-term anatomical changes, as observed in Tibetan monks who've meditated for many years. So these scientific studies are certainly not in conflict with it, and it's partly because these scientific studies show its benefits that quite a number of committed atheists, like the famous American atheist Sam Harris, have taken up meditation. Not only that, Sam Harris actually gives online meditation courses. So in the Middle Ages in Europe, there wasn't a conflict either. The official philosophy of Christian theology then, as codified by St. Thomas Aquinas, was a kind of Christian animism. It said nature is alive, animals and plants have souls, stars and planets are living beings with intelligence. The universe is full of angels, intelligent spirits that help guide the course of nature and guide our lives. That's the world in which Christianity developed, in which the great Gothic cathedrals were built. It's only since the 17th century, with this machine theory of nature, that Christian theologians have had to try and fit theology into a mechanical universe. And how they do that is by, or how they have tried to do it, is by saying, well, God is the engineer who made the world machine and designed the universe, pressed the start button, and then stood back, and everything happens automatically in nature, and God is outside nature. We may reach God through prayer, but only humans can do that, and God's got nothing to do with the rest of nature. And so it was a very, very limited view of a kind of supernatural God outside nature. Now, that's the kind of God atheists don't believe in, and I don't believe in either. But I think there's a move in Christian theology at the moment to return to the much more holistic, mystical tradition in the Middle Ages and in the earlier part of the church history. This was very much what Father Bede was doing, and I learned a lot about this from him in India. And I think that there's no particular reason why religions should find themselves in conflict with science, except when science is dominated by a materialist atheist worldview that's a philosophy rather than science. The method of science is different from the overarching materialist philosophy. That is in conflict with all religions because it's intrinsically atheistic and says consciousness is nothing but the brain. But it's not an essential part of science, and part of my own work and a lot of other people's work at the moment is to try and move on. So the scientific philosophy becomes more holistic, more ecological, recognizing consciousness and interconnection, purpose in nature and in evolution, and of course recognizing psychic phenomena and the importance of altered states of consciousness. All this is actually happening in the field of consciousness studies, in recent ecological thinking. I'd like to think my own work is contributing to that. In medicine, there's a ferment of ideas as more holistic practices integrated with the more reductionist, materialist type of Western medicine.
Interesting. Talking about consciousness and your work, right? Are there any practical tips that people can do to understand or reach that level of consciousness when they understand that they're more conscious, or they can become more conscious, and also, realize that psychic experience that they have at times or altered state of consciousness? Any practical tips that you have on top of your mind?
Well, I think in my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, the simplest and most fundamental of all those practices is gratitude. There's now many studies in the realm of positive psychology that show that grateful people are much happier than ungrateful people. They're also more popular. And that's not really surprising. Ungrateful people are people who take things for granted, who feel entitled and think everyone should be doing things for them, don't bother saying thank you or acknowledging it. They're entitled to it. And if things don't go right, they usually complain. Well, not surprisingly, such people are less popular than people who are grateful.
Correct.
And who are usually happier anyway. And being grateful is very simple. I mean, it's just I myself at the end of each day think about things that have happened during that day for which I feel grateful, and aspects of my life for which I'm grateful. I'm just being alive, I'm grateful for, and being healthy, and having a wife and family, and local community and food. I mean, there are so many things we often take for granted. So being grateful gives us a sense of being in the flow, and being in the flow We receive things, we give things, and giving thanks is part of it, giving back. And being in the flow is part of a spiritual process. It's part of the aspect of spirituality is not just states of consciousness where you feel still and restful. In the Hindu version of Sat, Chit, Ananda, I would say it's more the Sat state that one's accessing through meditation. But the flow there's this flow of energy in the Christian tradition. The Holy Spirit is the energy of God in all creation, in sunlight, in nature, in us. The equivalent, I suppose, in Indian philosophy would be Shakti, the energetic principle that works through all things. And insofar as we link through, we're part of a flow, we feel part of the fundamental nature of things, more connected and happier. Meditation is, of course, a very good way of calming the mind and letting thoughts becoming detached from the ongoing internal dialogue. And I won't say much about that because I'm sure many people in India are familiar with techniques of meditation. But singing and chanting are spiritual practices which are common to all traditions. I mean, chanting in monasteries and churches, Sufi chanting, of course, bhajans and kirtan and devotional chanting, and the chanting of mantras and in temples. Chanting causes people to enter different states of consciousness, and when you're chanting together, because you have to breathe together if you're chanting in synchrony, people become physiologically synchronized. Even their heartbeats tend to become more similar. There have been many studies on this. This makes people feel much more connected. It builds community and leads to this sense of connection. And if it's a mantra, then on my own ideas of morphic resonance, by chanting that mantra, you come into resonance with all those who've chanted it before you. So you tap into an entire tradition of that mantra, which is why people chant mantras, and why they think it's important to keep them the same from generation to generation, because it's, I think, the most direct way of coming into resonance with the whole tradition, and which helps to bring about altered states of consciousness. So those are some of the ways. Another thing, actually, I learned about, really, I was very influenced by this in India, is pilgrimage, going on a sacred journey on foot. A lot of people do it by train and bus, and the distances are very long in India, so obviously you have to be practical. But I was very impressed by the fact that all over India I saw pilgrims on the road walking to their destinations. And in South India, the big ones, like the one in Kerala, Sabrimala, and there are all sorts of, and Our Lady of Velangani in Tamil Nadu. All religions have and shrines of Sufi saints, dargahs near Hyderabad. I used to visit with Muslim friends, as well as going to some of the great temples. Well, I was very impressed by this, the archetypal power of these sacred journeys. And here in Britain, pilgrimage was abolished by royal command in 1538 as part of the Protestant Reformation. Protestants didn't like it because they thought it was too Catholic. But it's actually deep and archetypal. And here in Britain, I'm a patron of an organization called the British Pilgrimage Trust, which is reopening the ancient footpath pilgrimage routes. Pilgrimage is booming in Europe. Santiago de Compostela in Spain, that pilgrimage, ancient medieval pilgrimage, was revived in 1987 when 1,000 people walked there. Last year, 330,000 people walked there.
Wow.
I mean, this is huge by European standards.
Correct.
Nothing like the Kumbh Mela or anything like this. I mean, this is all like pretty small fry compared with India. But here, it's a very significant cultural shift here in Europe. And I think that going on a pilgrimage on foot, preferably walking through paths that are not on roads, and it's not much fun walking along an Indian road. But the footpaths that go here in Britain, we have a traditional set of footpaths crossing the whole country, so you can do it through farms and woods and without having to walk on roads, which makes it a way of connecting with nature. So anyway, those are some of the things that I think can help connect us. And what these altered states of consciousness do is make us aware that our own consciousness is part of a much larger realm of consciousness that includes not only the ultimate source of consciousness, which we can call God, the absolute, the ultimate, or whatever, but also many other forms of consciousness. I mean, there are many gods, goddesses, angels, saints. There's all sorts of spiritual beings, not all of them necessarily friendly, but our consciousness is not just isolated inside our head, which is what materialists would tell us.
Exactly.
And if we believe the materialist view, then it means we're extremely isolated, we're cut off, we're separated. And these are all things that lead to depression, a feeling of alienation, isolation, and depression. And I think it's no surprise that in the West, the most common mental disorder is depression on a massive scale. And when I lived in India, and especially working in villages among quite poor people, because I was doing agricultural work, I was surprised how happy most of them seemed to be. There were lots of laughter and smiles, and these people had every reason to be depressed, and yet they weren't. I'm sure some of them were, and some farmers commit suicide because they're in despair, and so on. So it's not as if everybody's happy, but the general level of atmosphere of joy and being able to live in the present spiritual practice is about living in the present and being able to be connected with the present.
Interesting.
And it's a very important thing, and a lot of people in India, poor people, were able to do that. Maybe because they had no choice, but living in the present, meditations about coming into the present, singing and chanting about coming into the present. And in my latest book, Ways to Go Beyond, I discuss sports as a spiritual practice. It's not normally one, but in the West, in the secular West, sports are the principal way, I think, in which people actually, without realizing it, are having spiritual practices. You have to come into the present in sports. If you're skiing uphill at 60 miles an hour, it's no use worrying about paying bills or some resentment you have about somebody who really annoyed you the day before. You've totally got to be there, or else you go over a cliff and you're dead.
True.
If you're in the middle of a football game, or if you're in a cricket match and there's a fast bowler running towards you, about to bowl a ball towards you, then you're totally in the present. If you're going to be any good at the sport, you've got to be totally in the present. So I think sports are actually a way in which people are brought into the present. And in the secular West, where spiritual practices have been out of fashion for several generations, this has become a kind of secular substitute. Even watching a match where you're completely involved in the game, see someone being caught out or something like that, the whole crowd has a shared emotion.
Exactly.
It means that we're interconnected with others as well as being in the present. And these are key features of spiritual experience. That's why I think it's only partly a joke when people say that, football is his religion or cricket's his religion.
Makes sense now. Yeah. And that's a very good observation that you made, with regards to that, where all of us are being connected and have the same response when something like that comes on TV. It's the same reaction, right? When let's say somebody's watching cricket and somebody's out, that's the same reaction we have. I know.
Yes.
I know, Rupert, we're coming to the end of the interview, so I'm gonna end the entire perspective, the entire conversation with last two questions that I have for you. The first one being, all this thing that you personally have experienced yourself, right? Like moving out of, coming out from England to going to India, and that kind of traveling was one of the reasons why you got to, you got the exposure to see what is happening in the world, right? So what do you think people should do when they think they are in the materialistic idea, or they're not sure as to what to do in life? They are not sure about anything in life. Do you think traveling is something that they should do to get more exposure and understand themselves?
Well, I think one of the things that the present COVID emergency has shown us is that a lot of traveling is not as necessary as people thought. And personally, I've done a lot of traveling, but I'm actually very happy not to be traveling, and I'm planning to do very little from now on, partly because the carbon emissions from aeroplanes are so high. I think we should all be traveling less by air. What I'm for me, coming to India was a vital experience. But I think it's not necessary for everybody to travel. I mean, I don't think tourism does much good. I think tourism could be transformed. Tourism is a kind of secularized pilgrimage. The English invented tourism after pilgrimage had been banned. And I think the best paradigm shift really would be to shift back from tourism to pilgrimage. And to go, if we travel, go to sacred places. I mean, in India, this is how most people travel, or used to travel anyway. They didn't go on holidays, they went on pilgrimages, and pilgrimages are a kind of holiday. So I think recovering this pilgrimage dimension would make travel much more meaningful for a lot of people, and mean they'd have to do frenetically rushing around the world to tourist hotspots. It seems to me just eco-hostile and undesirable. And it doesn't mean people learn much about the culture. I mean, I was very lucky to be able to live in India, to work in India, to live in a house with an Indian family, to work with Indian colleagues, to live in an Indian ashram. Because it was a Christian ashram, paradoxically, it was more Indian than the Hindu ashrams, which are full of spiritual tourists from Europe and America. Very few actually went to the Christian ashram. It was mostly Indian Christians from Kerala and Tamil Nadu. I was very lucky to be able to be immersed in Indian culture by living and working there. A mere touristic visit, I don't think would have done anything like that for me. So I think if people are going to travel, go on a pilgrimage, and if people come to England from India, for example, then when in London, visit Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's Cathedral, go to the principal sacred places, not just as a tourist, but light a candle, say a prayer. So I make a point whenever I visit a new city or town, I try to go to the central sacred place as soon as I can and make an offering and connect with that place. I mean, in India, I go to temples and do a puja, and in Muslim countries, I go to mosques or and say a prayer, or to dargahs. In Christian countries, I go to cathedrals or the main church. And that way we connect with the place, the sacred center of the place where people have worshipped and been inspired over the centuries. And I always ask for blessings on my visit there, blessings on the place and those who live there. And I feel that if we're going to travel, turning our journeys into pilgrimages and giving them a spiritual purpose makes them much more meaningful.
Perfect. Awesome. Because I personally relate to that experience, because I remember one of the greatest awakenings I had was when I traveled for a month, traveling from, because I had no clue what to do in life. I was not sure. I was kind of an agnostic, turning into an atheist. But then I started going to, different places, these pilgrimages, as you just said, dargahs and then temples. And that is when I truly discovered myself, I feel. And I'm great at the place I am today and grateful for all those instances, because rather than just traveling, I turned it into a pilgrimage. Now, when you just said that, it just hit me. Right. So that's a great advice that I would recommend all my listeners as well. So give it a shot. And one last question, Rupert, before I let you go. Now, if you could give, two advice to all the listeners out here today, it could be anything, philosophical, religious, spiritual, any two advice that can help them lead a successful and a better life, what those two advice will be.
Well, I think first, I've already said, be grateful, that spend some time every day, even if it's only a minute or two, acknowledging and giving thanks for the blessings. We all have blessings on our lives. Just being alive is a blessing.
True.
And secondly, I would say pray. Prayer, I find, is a way of putting my own concerns. I'm now talking about ordinary petitionary prayer. All prayers start with an invocation. We connect with a spiritual being to whom we're praying, a god, a goddess, a saint, angel, or we start with a spiritual connection. And praying for things that are of concern in our lives, things that worry us, things that we're concerned about, people who are sick, our own problems. This is a way of sacralizing our problems and bringing a bigger consciousness to bear on our daily life through daily regular prayer. And I think that it's an extremely helpful practice. And because we're putting these prayers in the context of a greater being than ourselves, it means that we have to put our personal intentions in that context too. In the Lord's Prayer, which I pray every day, one of the phrases is, "Thy will be done." So I'm praying for God's will to be done, and what I want has to fit in with that, the bigger picture.
Yes.
So positive thinking is a kind of prayer which is non-spiritual and is entirely about getting ahead in the world oneself. People have positive intentions for success, more sales, seducing the girl they're attracted to, etc. And actually, one of the principal exponents of positive thinking, who has brought out the book, How to, The Power of Positive Thinking by that famous American positive Norman Vincent Peale, he was the principal proponent. One of his great devotees as a teenager was none other than Donald Trump. Donald Trump is an example of positive thinking. Think it, and you can change reality. He's changed reality just by his chaotic thoughts. He is actually a horrible proof of the power of positive thinking. In his case, I would say they're not all positive. They're positive for him, his thoughts, but they're not very positive for the rest of the world.
True.
But to avoid the Donald Trump syndrome, it's important prayers done to not just positive thinking or the formulation of selfish intentions, but within this larger context.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rupert, for taking your precious time out and joining us on the podcast. The wisdom and the knowledge you spread, I'm sure a lot of people will sit and ponder about these things and, implement the practical tips that you've advised, which will help them lead a better, fulfilling life.
Very good to talk to you.
Awesome. This brings us to the end of this episode, and hope you at least had one takeaway from this interview. If you have any questions or want to talk to me personally, you can find me at www.silawathirshad.com. See you soon.